Hello there, my name is Friar.Fetz. I'm a conventual Franciscan operating out of the Chicago province, and this is my vocation story. This is how Jesus called me, this is how I came to be where I am now. If you'd known me when I was growing up, when I was in high school especially, you would not have thought that I was going to be a priest, and if you'd said that to me, then I would have laughed at you, and so would the rest of my classmates. It's not that I didn't have faith, it's just, it wasn't the most important thing in my life. I wasn't particularly devout, and though I was raised in a strong Catholic family, by the time I left for college, I really didn't see much purpose for the faith, for the church, or for Jesus Christ. And so that relationship dwindled as I went to college. And in college, I followed my own way. And at first I thought that that was freeing. I thought that I was liberated because I didn't have my parents, they couldn't drag me to church, and I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I did. And I fell into more of that party lifestyle that's so common on our college campuses. And yet, it didn't take long before that initial freedom, that initial sheen began to wear off of my life, and I found that I felt life was meaningless, and that I didn't have any purpose or direction. The more I felt that, the more I looked for it, and I looked for it more in the unhealthy relationships that I developed and in the partying, and less in my family and not at all in the church. As you can imagine, such a self-centered lifestyle was destructive. My relationships with my family and the people I had used to call my friends became more and more strained, and I began to feel more and more empty the further and further I got into it. At the very pit, at the very darkest place that I ever reached, I had an encounter with God. And in that encounter, I came to realize that the path that I had been on was destroying me from the inside out. That I was so many different things to so many different people that I'd lost who I really was, because I was looking for the approval of my peers, but I wasn't being honest with my family. And there were many different people that were floating around within me, none of whom were actually me. And coming out of that experience, I realized that I had a choice to make. That choice was either that I could continue down the same self-destructive spiral, or I could journey with God, and I could discover what it was that meant, first and foremost by living a life of honesty, by living a life that was authentic. And I realized that the way that needed to happen was by coming clean to my parents and asking for their forgiveness for the way that I treated them, for the ways in which I misspent their money in my college on the partying, and coming clean, renewing that relationship. And so I called up my mother and I asked for her forgiveness. And at the end of that conversation, I remember feeling a profound sense of peace, that the burden which had been on my shoulders was no longer there. And it was funny because 2 weeks later, I went back home for Christmas break. And it was the first time I went back home that I wanted to be with my family. It was the first time that I wanted to go back to Mass, because now I had this renewed sense of the presence of God in my life and of the healing that He was bringing. And it was so interesting the way that the first reading at midnight Mass struck my heart when the prophet Isaiah said, "The people in darkness have seen a great light, and the rod that was on their shoulders has been smashed." This was the life that I was living at that very moment. And I walked out of that Mass, the first Mass of my adulthood that I really wanted to attend, feeling like Jesus had spoken directly to me. When I went back to college then for my next semester after that Christmas break, my parents recommended a nearby parish to me, and I started attending there. And the Dominican priests who ran that parish were very eloquent speakers, true to their call as the order of preachers. And I found that many of their homilies really connected with me and really challenged me to grow, because of course, being so new back to the faith, I didn't have a strong sense of what it really meant for me, and there were still many things about the church that I disagreed with, and so they started to speak to that in a powerful way. In particular, one Sunday, they ended the Mass announcing that that day was Vocations Awareness Day and that it inaugurated Vocations Awareness Week. At that time, it was the feast of the baptism of the Lord. Now we celebrate that particular week beginning with Good Shepherd Sunday, but that's the way that it was back then. And at the time I walked out of Mass like, okay, whatever, that's nice, okay, you want all the young men in the congregation to think about becoming a priest. Well, I'll tell you one thing, that's not me. But it was funny because that was the week then that I got the call. That I started to click with me that every time I left Mass, I actually, now that it was my choice and I wasn't being dragged there by my parents, I felt happy. I walked out with a little light in my eyes and a little spring in my step. And the more I started to think about that week, it was like, oh, well, maybe there's something here. And there was one time in prayer when I just felt like God said directly to me, I want you to be a priest. And that really hit me. No, that's not what I want. That's not what I'm going to do. But the more I thought about it, the more I prayed about it, the more I realized, oh, wow, this is actually where my fulfillment will lie. Because throughout my life, even when I wasn't a practicing Catholic, throughout my life, I always felt this strong need to be present to those who were marginalized. I always wanted to teach. I always wanted to promote social justice. These were all the things that I stood for. And yet I'd never really found a way of integrating them all into one package, one lifestyle that would actually allow me to do all of those things. And the more I thought about the priesthood, the more I realized, oh my gosh, the priest actually is all of those things. The priest is teacher. The priest is maybe not a psychologist, strictly speaking, but he is the one who heals souls. He is the one who promotes social justice. And that actually fits, that works for me. And it was a very humbling place to come to realize that, yeah, actually, this thing that I had never even considered myself may actually be the way that I'm most fulfilled. As I began to consider that more and talk about it more with one of the priests that I knew, I started to think that was entirely right for me. So it wasn't just a fleeting, momentary thought. It was something that was starting to be confirmed by the people around me and through the guidance of others. And there was one day that really struck me in particular as I was praying after receiving communion at Mass. And I'd started to go to Mass daily now as a result of this call. It was like, well, I guess I should probably start to try to live this. So I started to go to Mass daily, and after receiving communion one of those days, I was praying to myself in my pew the prayer attributed to St. Francis. You probably know the one that goes, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is despair, hope. And it goes so on. Well, I realized two things as I was praying that prayer. Number one, that prayer was the story of my life. Where there had been darkness, now there was light. Where there had been sadness, there was now joy. It's not one of the lines in the prayer, but where there had been meaninglessness, there was now purpose. And the second thing that struck me, and it's hard to describe, but the second thing that struck me was I felt as if St. Francis was standing behind me and was beckoning me, as though Francis himself was saying, I want you in my order. And I'd never thought about becoming a Franciscan before because there weren't any Franciscans where I was living. There in Seattle, there were Dominicans and there were Jesuits and there were diocesan priests, but no Franciscans. And so many people will ask me, well, how did you become a conventual Franciscan? How did you even find them? Because they're nowhere near Washington State. Well, you're right. And in fact, neither were any other Franciscans that I'd ever encountered before. I really hadn't encountered any Franciscans personally. And it wasn't until I spoke to a nun that I knew and expressed this to her and said, hey, this is what's been put on my heart, but I just don't know where to go with this. And she said, oh, I happen to know a few Franciscans. And she put me in touch with some Franciscans she'd met from Chicago. And so I gave them a call and they brought me out to visit. And what struck me when I stepped in the walls of that friary was that there I was called to be more authentically myself than anywhere else. What I mean by that is this. The things that I would do around my peers to make them think more highly of me, respect me, or think I was funny, all of those airs that I would put on were not welcome in the friary. It was as though the friars wanted me to take off all of my masks and just be me. And it was honestly very difficult sometimes when the jokes I was used to telling or the ways that I would try to make myself appear smarter than the rest would fall flat. But what I realized walking out was that in the end, I was more Thomas there than I was anywhere else. And so I started to visit more and more frequently. And every time I left from those visits, I felt like I'd grown. It wasn't just that I came and I saw something I liked, it was that I came and saw someone that I liked. I saw the me that I was being called to be, the person whom Jesus had made me to be. And I think that that's what those who find their married vocation will experience as well, that the person that they fall in love with will make them more themselves, will make them more authentic. And that's what I found in this community. And so as soon as I graduated college, I entered the very next week. The timelines just worked out that well. And after I entered, the same thing continued. It was, in fact, more intense now that I was living there, that the false selves that I had put on were taken off. They weren't welcome there. The only person that was welcome there was the me that God had created and had called. And that's continued to this very day. I now have 2 more years until I become a priest, but I've made my vows to be a Franciscan forever, such that even if I decided that I wasn't being called after all to the priesthood, I will still be a Franciscan brother until the day that I die. And I'm so happy to say that because I am the most authentic now that I've ever been. The light that was given to me when I returned to the church is only shining more and more brightly every day. And I'm so grateful for that. And I'm so grateful to share it as a brother who is able to walk with those who are suffering. In the future, to share it as a priest who will be able to bring Christ to those in most need, to be able to bring Christ to the people through the sacraments, through the preaching, through reconciliation, but above all, through the person that God is creating me to be, because he continues to recreate me day by day by day. And that person, more and more, bears the light of Christ, not because I do anything to earn it, not because I make it happen, but simply because Christ has called me here so that I may mirror his love to his people and to a world so much in need of his love. So that's my story, that's my call. That's how Jesus has called me and has continued to work in my life. My advice to any young person who is afraid of following the call would be this. First off, acknowledge that fear. Any fear that we have in our hearts immediately loses some hold over us if we just say, oh, okay, this is what's going on. Like, I don't want to do that, or I'm afraid that I might lose some of myself if I follow this call, or if I follow whatever feelings are emerging from me. So the first thing is to acknowledge it. Then the second thing is to bring it to Jesus, because Jesus already knows what's happening in your heart, but when you acknowledge it and you bring it to him, something new happens. It loses its power and he begins to help us through it. But then the next thing I would say is, okay, so you have to know where you stand and you have to bring that to the Lord and see what he will do with it. But the most important thing is that we need to have within our heads the right thought about who Jesus is and what the call is. We have to set ourselves straight. And what those fears will do is they'll show us those places in our hearts where we may have a misguided notion about who Jesus is, because Jesus loves us. He loves us. And everything that he does within us is for our good, for our betterment. And he would never lead us in a call that makes us miserable. And I actually know a young man who has just left the seminary because he thought that he was called to be a priest. And he was afraid to follow that call, but he started powering through it anyways. And it turned out that he wasn't being called to be a priest, and he wasn't happy there, and he wasn't acknowledging it until this very year. And all of a sudden he realized, oh, okay, that's not my call. Jesus doesn't actually want me here. He wants me to be married, and that's the call that he has on my heart. He wasn't called to be a priest, and he wouldn't have been happy doing so, and he recognized that. Wherever God calls us is where we will be the most fulfilled, because he makes us with a plan for us. And that plan isn't just for us. That plan is a way to build up the people around us. It's ultimately a way of showing our love selflessly. We will be most happy in whatever call it is that God has placed on us. And in fact, for my own call as a Franciscan, I have to take a vow of poverty, a vow of obedience, and a vow of chastity. The easiest way of thinking of those things is to think, oh, I don't have much stuff. I go where I'm told to go, and I live in community with my brothers instead of with a family, and so I won't be married. But all of those things, negative as they may sound, the things that I have to give up, actually letting go of those things liberates me. Because without my possessions, all of a sudden they don't own me, they don't run me, and my needs are all taken care of. Going where I'm told may sound difficult, but actually those places where I'm centered are always unexpected joys. I meet new people I never would have met. I'm able to serve in new ways that I wouldn't have been able to serve, and I find new parts of myself that are brought out that I never would have known were there if I hadn't gone someplace I'd never anticipated. And the vow of chastity, likewise, is not a vow not to love, it's a vow to love everybody I encounter. And so what I've discovered is that in the call to priesthood and the call to Franciscanism, within these calls is great, great joy for those who are called to them. Just as we've seen married couples that have such a profound love for each other and whose families are very joyful. The same thing in religious life and priesthood, wherever it is that we're called to go, we will discover great joy, great fulfillment in our truest selves. We don't lose ourselves when we pursue these calls. We actually discover the greatest joy we could ever imagine there. So if I encountered a young person who had some obstacles to entering, maybe say a relationship with somebody or whatever thoughts, whatever things they might not want to give up, what I would say is this. The call will always entail sacrifice. Everything that's worth doing entails sacrifice. If you want to become a great artist or a great musician, countless hours must be spent in practice, and they won't always be fun. They will be the hours of practicing the scales on the piano when you don't want to. They will be the hours of fine-tuning the strokes of a brush. In sports, it's the same way. It will be the hours spent in a weight room, being yelled at by your coach. Whatever it takes in order to advance to the next level. Anything worth doing takes sacrifice. And yes, in order to follow the call, some sacrifices must be made. Relationships may have to be ended. The relationship with our families may have to change a little bit because we'll see them less frequently as we move to another place for schooling, etc. In all of those things, the sacrifices that we have to make will in the end make the goal sweeter if it's the call that we're being given. And so it's difficult. And I remember one couple that I knew in college, and they were dating, and they were great together. They were a great couple. But there was one day when they both went to pray, and there'd been some tensions between them, even though they were happy as a couple, some things just weren't quite clicking. And she received this message in prayer: you need to let him go. And she didn't know why. But afterwards, they went for a walk, and he told her, I don't know how to tell you this, but I think God's calling me to be a priest. And she realized at that moment what it was that she was being called to do, was to let him go. And he's now being ordained a priest this summer. And she is now engaged to be married to somebody else. And they're both much happier in those vocations because they've followed their call. And what I would say, especially to somebody who's dating and who doesn't want to give that up, is this. If you are feeling the call, there's two things to remember. Number one, following that feeling is never something that you will regret. Even if you end up not being called to be a priest, the time that you spend in the seminary is a time that you will grow, you will become a better man, and you will better be able to serve your future spouse or your future vocation, whatever it will be. It's never time wasted if we follow in faith the call of God. And the second thing I would say is this. If the person that you are dating authentically loves you and really wants what's best for you, then they want you to follow the call of God. And they want you to go where you will be happiest, which is where God is calling you. And so if that love is authentic, then they won't try to hold you for themselves. And yes, it will be painful. I'm not lying about that. These sacrifices are always painful. But given to the Lord, they will bear fruit. And if it's coming from a place of authentic love and authentic faith, then you will both want to pursue what God is calling you to.